trade has always been one of the most efficient ways to transmit potentially deadly viruses.
Known as COVID-19, rapidly spread.
When wild animals from different parts of the world are held in close proximity with weakened immune systems due to stress,
will China finally be forced to take the necessary steps? Madam Secretary General, the floor is yours.
By IFA and Freeland on preventing pandemics.
Greetings from historic Town Square Community Center in the city of Green Lake, home to Wisconsin's deepest inland lake. Before we begin, though, a somber reminder. 20 years ago on this date, life changed for you and me. Two numbers explain it all. 9/11. Like 9/11, the present COVID pandemic challenges world health and security. Cooperation and collaboration among people worldwide will be required for managing, sustaining, and meeting people's needs. This panel focuses specifically on food security and protection of Earth's natural capital. The Freeland Film Festival 2021 is pleased to announce a better world beyond pandemics. This year's festival takes place in two stages, September 10 and 11, a COVID-friendly in situ event at Town Square, Freeland's U.S. home office, followed by December 3 through 5, where a virtual theater will be produced out of Freeland's main operations base in Bangkok, Thailand, for the world to watch. Freeland is a frontline organization working for a world free of wildlife trafficking and human slavery. In addition, because of the novel coronavirus, Freeland has been partnering with 80 other organizations in a global campaign called EndPandemics. Solutions from the Alliance of Frontline Organizations to End Pandemics include the following action pillars: reduce demand, protect nature, stop wildlife trafficking, and reform farming. It is this last pillar, reforming agriculture, that is the main focus of this panel. So, what is the connection between regenerative agriculture and pandemics? My name is Tom Eddy, and I will serve as moderator for today's panel that explores the topic of regenerative agriculture. Two quick reminders before we begin. First, this panel discussion meets in situ and will be live streamed through Facebook. Online audience viewers may submit questions via Facebook to our panelists anytime, and these will be addressed at the end of the panel discussion. Secondly, the film Living Soil will be shown immediately following this panel. This documentary is produced by the Soil Health Institute and tells the story of farmers, scientists, and policymakers working to incorporate agricultural practices that benefit soil health for years to come. These are the following key takeaways from this panel that you'll be learning about. Regenerative agriculture can ensure better returns from all 5 forms of capital: human, social, natural, physical, and financial. Regenerative agriculture diversifies farmland in ways appropriate to the locale and to the rural economy. Regenerative agriculture permits agro-system functions both above and below ground by creating niches for colonizing organisms. Regenerative agriculture reduces environmental impacts on local to global scales by working with nature. Regenerative agriculture improves profitability by lowering costs and raising productivity and market quality. Regenerative agriculture establishes climate and wildlife-friendly production systems that reduce the ecological and carbon footprints. And finally, regenerative agriculture reduces the risks of future new zoonotic diseases by restoring the ecological balance in deforested areas and minimizing the risk of transferring disease organisms to humans. I am pleased to help introduce our four panelists. While they come from varied backgrounds and experiences, what they all share in common is their expertise, passion, and advocacy for regenerative agricultural practices that benefit land, water, and people. Panelists include Dr. Roger R.B. Leakey, a tropical biologist and agriculturalist who joins us from Scotland. Mr. Mark Eberle, filmmaker and founder of Smart Agro Sustainable Innovations, who is streaming from Germany. And Mr. Matt Borson and Dr. Ken Bates, regenerative ag farmers here from the Green Lake area. Now our panelists will introduce themselves, beginning with Dr. Leakey, followed by Mark Eberle, Matt Borson, and then finally Ken Bates. Dr. Leakey.
Okay, good.
There we go.
Good morning. And thanks very much for the invitation to join you on this panel. I'm Roger Leakey. I'm a third-generation white African, born and brought up in Kenya. I've worked most of my career around 100 countries around the world, mostly tropical countries. About 70% of those have been in Africa. I'm now retired and have been Director of Research at the World Agroforestry Centre in Nairobi, working globally. And I've been Professor of Agroecology at James Cook University in Australia, and also a lead author for the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development. Currently, I'm a Vice President of the International Tree Foundation in its 99th year, and a council member of Global Evergreening Alliance and a member of the EndPandemics Alliance. Today, I'm representing hundreds of millions of subsistence farmers in Africa. And I ask you to put yourselves into their shoes for a moment. They have about 2 hectares of land, and that's often fragmented around the village, on which they have to produce all the food and all the other needs, day-to-day needs of their family, without any other opportunities. They have zero financial capital and an income of about $1.50 a day, which comes to something like $450 a year. So with that level of poverty and with no social security safety net, they are often hungry, malnourished, and they're marginalized in society. They have no political clout or voice. Perhaps I can have my first slide. So here we're looking at a picture of degenerative agriculture and regenerative agriculture. Basically, the levels of poverty of subsistence farmers mean that they are forced into this degenerative state where they get very low crop yields, they have suffering from environmental degradation, they have poverty, and the consequences of that are greenhouse gas emissions and a loss of biodiversity. And so what we're trying to do is to turn that around with a regenerative approach so that they get high yields, that the environment is rehabilitated, that they generate income and improve their well-being, and that through the incorporation of trees into those systems, they get greenhouse gas storage, also creating a wildlife habitat. And as you can see from this diagram, we want to be able to do that, and I think we can do that on less farmland. And associated with all of that, we're trying to create a new greener economy.
Okay, Mark Eberle, if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Hello there, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Mark Eberle. I'm currently in Germany, but normally I'm based in Cambodia, and where I founded Smart Agro Sustainable Innovations. I used to be a filmmaker making documentary films, and 10 years ago, I made my only real development film about a experimental agriculture project in Cambodia, and I learned a lot doing this film, realizing the opportunities and the possibilities of this regenerative agricultural technology, which really gives us a second chance to turn agriculture into the solution rather than the problem. Currently, most of the greenhouse gases in Asia, 44%, are generated by agriculture. And so it is a giant opportunity to really redesign the practices, help farmers to make more money, as Roger Leakey just do, and turn this whole system into a solution. And that's what we're doing at Smart Agro in the similar way, like in Africa, where the situation is dire. Most of the smallholder farmers are really below or shortly above the poverty line, and regenerative agriculture is a great opportunity to turn this around and help reduce poverty, as well as increase food security and food safety. And that's what we're trying to do in Cambodia. And thanks very much for having me on this panel.
Thank you, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Borson, and along with my wife, 2 boys, a crew of volunteers and dedicated employees, we farm on about 100 acres just north of where we're sitting right now in Green Lake, Wisconsin. We're about, for the international audience, we're about 44 degrees north latitude. We're in the temperate zone. And the piece of land that we're working was at one time the traditional territory of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee nations. And before European settlers came and literally turned these ecosystems upside down, our landscape here was dominated by tall grass prairies and oak savannas, with some other ecosystems mixed in. And we've really made it a priority to look back in time to those ecosystems that once prevailed in this area and were productive and successful for thousands upon thousands of years, as inspiration for what we do now, which is to farm in the most natural and holistic way that we can. So the majority of our farm is dominated by permanent pastures. While we don't have the diversity and the depth of species that the native prairies had, we do have permanent ground cover over the vast majority of the farm. And we've incorporated a grass-fed beef herd to utilize that grass in a rotational grazing system that allows the soil to actually build over time. We are managing it in a way that's akin to what the bison and the prairie did over millennia. And the result of those grassland ecosystems were some of the most productive ecosystems in the world, or are still. We've lost a great deal of grasslands across the entire world. So we're doing our part on our little piece of land here in Wisconsin to bring back that stability and regenerating the soil that ecosystem can provide. On a smaller piece of land, just over an acre, we grow certified organic vegetables, and we do so in a very intensive way using a permanent bed system that allows us to avoid almost all tillage and produce highly nutrient-dense foods, and what we hope is a sustainable system, one that we could continue to see yields and production for generations to come. And the system as a whole is meant to intensify our production to the smallest area of land that we can so that the overall ecosystem and the nature in the area has as much space as we can possibly provide. So we are a direct market farm. We sell all of our produce within 50 miles of the farm. And if I could sum up the goal or objective of our operation, it's a bit cliche, but I would say our aim is to leave the piece of land that we're on better than we found it, more biologically diverse, and having a higher function, a higher capacity to regenerate itself over time. And diversity is the main strategy that we employ to reach those goals. So,
Thank you, Matt.
Oh, good morning. My name is Ken Bates. I'm switching mics here. Hi, I'm Ken Bates. I'm a lifelong educator, and I consider myself a lifelong student. And Tom Eddy was one of my mentors, as he's provided help to so many people in Green Lake and around the world. And I'm sitting next to my other mentor, Matt Borsen. I purchased 27 acres of land next to Matt. It's called Hig Lake Farm, which is Norwegian for pleasant. And we're working on restoring that property, which has been degraded with a very low pH, trying to turn it around and make it habitat for pollinators and also for grazing. And we're going to use using a grazing model to regenerate that land. In my other roles, I'm on the Green Lake County Board of Supervisors, and also in one of a really challenging position, I'm on the Sanitary District Board of Commissioners. And part of our role is to provide a sewer system around Green Lake, which is Wisconsin's deepest freshwater inland lake. And a second goal of our organization is to help preserve the lake water quality. And right now, that is probably, to me, the biggest challenge that I've seen, and it's going to take a united effort to do it. So I think that this event today kind of shows how we're all stronger and we're all better if we work together.
Thank you, Ken. Let's go right into the questions. First question is for Dr. Leakey. Roger, would you please distinguish between sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture? How might they be similar, and yet how are they different?
Okay, thanks. So I think the question is to distinguish between sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture. How are they similar and how are they different? Well, for me, they're both catch-all terms, I think. And there are also some 20 other named forms of sustainable agriculture, things like climate-smart agriculture, eco-agriculture, conservation agriculture, multifunctional agriculture, evergreen agriculture, permaculture, and so on. And I think that this proliferation of terms is one of our problems globally, that it causes confusion for the public and for policymakers and donors. Nevertheless, I think all these terms have their place under certain circumstances, but I don't think it's useful really to get too hung up about their names. The important thing, I think, is to provide location-specific solutions to what we saw earlier, degenerative agriculture, and to reduce food and nutritional insecurity, poverty, climate change, habitat loss, social injustice, and the risk of zoonotic diseases like COVID. So I think this all means working with nature rather than against it, and to seek sustainable returns on the 5 forms of capital that were mentioned earlier: natural, human, social, physical, and financial. Because there is a tendency, I think, for humans to really just focus on financial capital. If we broaden that, then I think we have opportunities to improve the planet. So most of those names that I've just raised are forms of sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and they nearly all, or a high proportion of them, involve trees. And so why do they have so many trees? Well, I think in this next slide we see that trees can create niches for biodiversity. As trees get bigger, they create their own microclimate and microenvironment. So trees promote ecosystem functions above and below ground. And tree planting in degraded farmland initiates the development then of an agroecological succession that promotes increasingly complex food chains of all this wildlife and their food life cycles. And through that, they confer functionality and an ecological balance that is the basis of sustainability. So I prefer the concept of this more process-oriented approach to sustainably based, to be based on the role of trees as keystone species in agricultural systems. When planting polycultures, it is possible to manipulate the content of that system and the balance of species in the system. For example, by selecting species that discourage the colonization of pests of the main crops, and or by selecting those that attract the natural enemies of those pests. And this is known as the push-pull technology. In addition to all these niches, trees also provide multiple environmental services, as I show in my next slide, where we often hear that trees are the lungs of the world. And I think this is an underrepresentation of their role, because in addition to the transfer of carbon dioxide and oxygen and greenhouse gases, all are part of the process of photosynthesis and transpiration, trees are also, if you like, the kidneys of the world. They take up moisture from the soil, they transfer moisture up into the atmosphere to fall as rain, to then be recycled back into the system. And I think then also we see trees as part of the skin of the world, because they form the surface of the ground where nutrient recycling and carbon recycling occurs. And finally, and most importantly probably, I think trees are also the heart of the world, in that they are the driving forces behind the life cycles and the food chains that I've just mentioned. So with all these environmental services, trees are environmentally very important for sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And on top of that, they produce a very wide range of marketable food and non-food products, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide. I therefore prefer this more process-oriented term, agroforestry, which is defined as integrating trees into farming systems to create functioning ecosystems, as just described in the last slide. So it seems to me that it's important to find ways to integrate trees within farming systems. And of course, this is a bit more challenging in highly mechanized systems. If we move on to the next slide, what is agroforestry? Well, you can see examples here in various photographs showing a wide range of different species in different configurations and densities. And in fact, that level of variability is infinite. There's just huge numbers of opportunities to grow trees in all sorts of different ways in the farming system. And in these sorts of systems, studies around the world have basically found that something like a 50-50 mix occurs between indigenous and exotic species from other parts of the world.
Matt, as a regenerative ag farmer, Borson Farm employs practices that deliver USDA-certified organic produce. I think of organic farming as maybe perhaps being a subset of regenerative agriculture. So what exactly does that mean, USDA certified? And maybe you could cite some examples from Borson Farm.
All right. Well, I guess I'd have to agree with Roger that there are too many terms and they have a lot of baggage. I always find it interesting that when we say, or at a farming conference or a different event, we say we're certified organic. There's kind of a grumble often among farmers. Some people are really strong advocates of certified production. Others are very opposed to it, seeing it as kind of a government overreach. Certified organic is a term that we use because we are, in fact, inspected by a third party that comes once a year to verify that we are following the National Organic Program standards that's run by the USDA. And oftentimes, certified organic production is defined more by what it's not than what it is. You know, the regulations prohibit us from using synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers. And some of the beef that farmers have with organic certification is that it's really been kind of dumbed down, greenwashed, you might say, by large corporations that have wanted to tap into the organic market, so they've simply engaged in input substitution. So instead of using a synthetic pesticide, they use a natural pesticide that's approved for organic use. Or instead of using a synthetic fertilizer, they'll use just a pelletized fertilizer that's produced from a natural source, which is allowed under the regulations. At our farm, it means soil. I guess if I could sum it up in one word, the original spirit of the organic movement was all about a soils first approach to producing food, and the idea being that when we feed our soil and we take care of the diversity of organisms that are below the surface, that's going to enhance the immune system of our system in general, of our fields, of the land, and that in turn provides the benefits of an organic product, which is, we hope, we strive for nutrient density, a resilient system that doesn't rely on a lot of outside inputs. All of our fertility is derived, excuse me, from compost and or green manure cover crops. And so when you say what does certified organic production mean at our farm, it means that we're doing everything that we can to produce food in a system and make a living in a system that is actually building soil as opposed to constantly taking or removing, degrading our soil resource. And I think that would, in general, in terms of regenerative agriculture, what Roger was talking about with agroforestry, adding more stability and perennial aspects to the system, that's all enhances the life of the soil, and that, to me, is what it all comes down to in terms of our health and long-term viability.
Yeah, soil health, that's the bottom line. Mark, as a founder of AgroSmart Innovations, how do you see the goals and objectives for practicing regenerative agriculture?
So the objectives, I believe the question was, as Ken just so eloquently put, and Roger also, is really just to restore soil health, protect the soil from erosion and degradation and depletion, and restore soil fertility. And that's how you then start to basically regenerate and increase ecosystem health and balance the whole system. And through that, you can increase yields and profits of farmers. Obviously, you can enhance the resilience and mitigate risk from droughts and floods. And you can reduce emissions because of photosynthesis and sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere in soils. You can offset and remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, and you can then basically increase carbon content or soil organic carbon content in soils and make them more healthy and make them more, water can store more water in soils, and you can have a higher water infiltration in soils through the root systems of the cover crops. You basically mitigate floods like this, and you can use the humus as a sponge to basically hold more water, 1% more organic matter in 40 to 60,000 liters of water per hectare. And this way, you can basically stabilize the system and balance it out. I don't know, I brought a few slides from Cambodia of what we do, some examples. Maybe you can show them now or maybe later. I don't know. Yes, maybe that's good now. So this is really what we do. You can see sun hemp as a cover crop. It's a legume. It fixes a lot of nitrogen from the air in the soil, probably about 100 kilos per hectare of nitrogen that is free in an inorganic form and won't leach into waterways. And then we roll it with a roller crimper in front of the tractor and roll it down. We don't do it as a green manure. In the first step, when we train farmers, we do it as a green manure. But then in the second season, we roll it down. We level the field first before we plant the cover crop. We roll it down, and on the back, we have a no-till planter where we plant maize or rice or any grain really on the green cover that we roll down. And then in the next slide, you can see how the maize, basically in this case, germinates through the green cover of the rolled cover crop. If you can go to the next slide. Yes, so that is the maize germinating through the rolled cover crop, and the biomass will decompose and turn into fertilizer. It will basically cover the whole soil surface, so there's no weeds. You can this way save a lot of application of herbicides. You can save inputs of fertilizers because of the biomass that is fed back into the soil and decomposes quite quickly. You save labor costs, you save costs for machinery, gasoline. Obviously, you save costs for plowing. And so this way, basically, you can step by step improve the system, save a lot of investment costs and production costs for farmers, and increase the yields. In the next slide, you can see an example of the maize that is bigger. And you can see the three wins, really the increased profits, enhanced resilience, and reduced emissions. And because of this organic matter that you feed back into the soil, you basically store a lot of carbon. And you can see the benefits down there, the carbon cycling, the continuous input of carbon into the soil, and all these other benefits I mentioned earlier. And you can see basically there's no weeds in between the maize. And the maize looks really healthy, and we used very, very little inputs, little fertilizer, that's it. And we got a really good tonnage in Southeast Asia. You know, the tonnage is totally different, I guess, from the US, but we got about 7 tons on this, and that is really top notch for this region and this soil type. And the next slide, you can see in one field, really an example of how the redesigning of agriculture can turn into the solution. And on the left, you can see a lot of water still in the field. It doesn't really infiltrate because there's no root systems. This is the conventional tillage. It was plowed. You cannot even bring in the tractor, and you have a lot of emissions and nutrient leaching. And on the right-hand side, you can see the no-till with cover crop field, which has all the benefits that I mentioned earlier. And on the next slide, you can see the profit increase because we reduce the inputs, we reduce the costs, production costs of farmers. You can see already in the first year, the profit increases because many critics and the lobby in the past obviously have always tried to say there's the valley of death. If you transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture, the yields will go down a couple of years before they go up again. And so in this long-term trial that we did in Cambodia, you can see immediately the yields go up, profits go up. And you can see the rice is not up there with the cassava and the maize. But this rice trial was a bit complicated, and it was a photosensitive rice cultivar. That's why it's not as high, but even 30% more profit is already very good. In the meantime, we've done another rice trial with another cultivar, which is also much higher than in this slide. And the next slide, please. These are examples of perennial systems where we use cover crops on black pepper in this photo. This is living perennial cover crops. It's a wild peanut species with no real peanuts in the roots. And it's a small carpet, really very good to walk on for working conditions. It's also a legume, so it sequesters a lot of nitrogen and has a huge exudation from the roots to regenerate the soil fertility. And the next slide is an example of different orchards, mango, durian, or rubber. We really work on any crop in Cambodia. We do cashew nuts, we do palm trees, any kind of mixed systems. We design a lot of different systems and mix it all together, but it's always dependent on the value chain that's in place for the farmers, obviously, how they can sell their product to the market. And the last slide, you can see what is our current project. It's really developing a payment system for ecosystem services so that we can reward farmers for doing the right thing, really, and measure, verify impact, and measure the soil carbon accumulation that they manage on their fields, and quantify the soil carbon, and this way calculate how much CO2 they offset from the atmosphere and reward them with a transparent blockchain-based reward system for the carbon credits or carbon removal credits that we will be selling on their behalf on the voluntary carbon market internationally. So it's a further incentive for the farmers to really adopt these regenerative agricultural practices and get the reward for doing the right thing, really. And hopefully this way we can accelerate the adoption rates and scale these practices more quickly. And that's it really for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Excellent examples of climate mitigation with sequestering carbon through those practices. Ken, you mentioned in your introduction that you acquired 27 acres immediately west of Borson Farm, and you've been busy, I know. I've been out on the farm with you before, and I think of you no longer as a former superintendent. I think of you as a farmer. So what are some of the practices and objectives you've accomplished thus far in 3 years since you've owned the property?
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. I come from a long generation of farmers going back to the early 19th century, farmers that, people that immigrated from Norway and Germany. And I remember as a young child going out and getting the cows from the remote pasture. There was no kind of created tent that the cows stayed in and were 24 hours a day. So that kind of is my background, so I'm kind of returning to my roots. But one of the things that I've learned is that you have to be patient. Any of these things take time. If we go with traditional agricultural methods on my land, which degraded the soil, we go out and we kill all of the plants that are there. Then we would plant some plants, and then we would fertilize those plants to make them come up. We're doing it totally different. Our experiment is to use cows, how herbivores did in the past, to come in and graze, deposit fertilizer on the land, and then we can grow plants. Now, one of the things you saw in Mark's video was that no-till drill, which is a different type of drill where it makes a slit in the ground, and then in the back where those containers, seeds drop in to the ground, and then it automatically covers up the seed, and then the seed grows. Some of the grasses that Matt and I planted, which are native grasses to Wisconsin, were only planted at the depth of 1/4 of an inch. So it didn't involve a lot of soil disturbance, but it's going to take a lot of time. So if you can show that slide that I provided. Okay, on the left side, you can see Matt's cows there, and that is all native weeds. Not native weeds, but like you get in your, if you left your yard grow, that's what you would get. So underneath that are thousands and thousands of prairie seeds waiting to come up. But it's going to take them 2 or 3 years to establish. So how do you control it rather than going out and spraying it? We brought Matt's cows in, and on one side you can see the cows there with all of that wonderful ragweed that Matt loves, is gone. I don't know, how long did that take, Matt?
Just a few days. They went through that whole space.
Yeah, and all that nasty stuff you see, they really enjoyed it. They don't like thistles, but they ate everything else. So I guess I would say, to me, the thing that I'm in learning about regenerative ag, there's a very simple concept: do no harm. So that means do no harm to the soil, to the water, to native pollinators, which we're losing at an ever-increasing rate. And the other one I've heard, which was a good one on a podcast, was it's the how, not the cow. We have a tendency to blame cows, for this because we have these visions of these feedlots. But if you use cows in the correct way and manage them as Matt does and other farmers do, it can really be a benefit to the soil and to the planet.
Thank you, Ken. Just a follow-up question, or maybe a statement. When cows are being grazed this way and not in a feedlot, not eating corn, the methane production is considerably nil. Is that fair?
It definitely is reduced. The largest reduction in emissions comes from the elimination of the growing of annual crops to feed those cows. I would say 99.9% of feedlot beef are fed corn and soybeans, along with all of our other confinement, pork production and chicken production. They're all being fed corn and soybeans, so that corn had to be planted and it had to be fertilized. Fertilizer production is very, it releases a lot of greenhouse gases in the production of it. Then all of the transportation of the seeds, of the fertilizer, of harvesting the crop and then bringing the crop to the animals, all of that is eliminated in a grass-based system because the animals are doing all of that. We're taking the animals to the feed instead of taking the feed to the animals. So.
Okay, very good. Roger, back to you. Would you explain the causes of land degradation, food, nutritional insecurity, and poverty in less developed countries?
Thanks very much. Yes, this is a complex question, but I suppose you want a simple answer. As I've already said, subsistence farmers in Africa are trapped in poverty and hunger, malnutrition, social injustice, and all of that basically can be attributed to, I think, inappropriate top-down global policies and conventional practices that have stemmed from the colonial era and more recently through globalization, which is really aimed more at supporting life in the industrialized countries. So in a sense then the causes are flawed governance systems, and they typically lie at the heart of all of these problems. So the consequence of that for subsistence farmers is what I have called the downward spiral of the cycle of land degradation and social deprivation, which results in what we call a yield gap due to the underperformance of the main crop. and I will explain that a bit later on. But what we see here is that this downward spiral of land degradation is driven by poverty, and that poverty then drives land degradation. So it's a repeating cycle that results in this yield gap. If we're to solve that, then of course we have to try to find ways of reversing that cycle so that land rehabilitation can drive enhanced livelihoods, and enhanced livelihoods can drive land rehabilitation. And that's basically the way in which we have been closing the yield gap in subsistence farms. The other thought which really is relevant to this discussion is that at the bottom of this spiral, the risk of zoonotic disease like COVID is increased due to this downward spiral of sustainability. And we'll talk more about that later. In subsistence farming systems, I think the the resolution of this crop failure requires a near zero cost solution to restore soil fertility and health, and to improve the livelihoods of the local population, and so provide a ladder out of poverty and into the cash economy. Globally, the lack of income and financial capital is the cause of a divided society globally, where we have very rich and extreme poverty, as shown in the next slide. So here we have data for the median income per day by country, adjusted to purchasing power parity, and the blue line. And you can see that the blue line starts pretty much at zero on the left-hand side and goes up to a much higher figure on the right-hand side. And all the countries of Africa actually are found in the left-hand half of this graph. And the average income of a rural population in these development countries of Africa is somewhere around $450 a year, whereas their equivalent in the industrialized countries, according to data on the internet, is $70,000. So a massive difference. And one of the hoped outcomes of our regenerative agriculture process is to raise subsistence farmers out of poverty by boosting their income, and so to have positive outcomes on the rural and national economies. I think that finishes my response to that question.
Follow-up question, Roger. Can you cite the underlying principles that are applied in regenerative ag that provide solutions for these subsistence farmers?
The next question, I think, is to identify the basic underlying principles that are applied in regenerative agriculture. At the start of this panel session, Tom, our chairman, presented 7 general principles, so I'm not going to repeat those. Here I'm just going to mention those that I think are specific to subsistence farmers in Africa, whereas we've just been seeing life is very harsh and farming very difficult, with natural, social, and human capital severely depleted. So the principles basically are, as some of the other speakers have already said, diversify, diversify, and diversify, both ecologically, economically, and socially. And culturally and nutritionally and commercially, indigenous species have much to offer in terms of the critical role in terms of relevance and acceptance and untapped potential within that series of diversification. Second principle, I think, is to use a bottom-up grassroots community participation approach so that you get much better adoption and buy-in by innovations. This is very much the opposite of what I was saying earlier of the poor governance, top-down governance that has been imposed on these farmers in the past. And thirdly, we have the opportunity to invest in restoring the 5 forms of capital that we've talked about once or twice already during this panel session, and help them to therefore to climb out of bankruptcy at all 5 levels of capital. To do all of this, our African farmers have come up with a 3-step approach to close the yield gap that I have described as land maxing, as we'll see in the next slide in a moment. While all of these principles are crucial for my farmers, they are certainly not exclusive to their needs, and I think we've heard some of the similar comments made from the other speakers. Here then we're looking at the tropical, subtropical land use scenarios that are common. On the left-hand side of this slide, we have what's considered to be the conventional wisdom, where you have national reserves, nature reserves for conserving biodiversity, and you have intensive agriculture for food security. But unfortunately, as we've heard already, and I've said already several times, subsistence farmers cannot achieve this kind of intensive production of food for a whole suite of reasons. And so the consequence is that we have land failing, where we have low production, and that's associated with a loss of social economic benefits and also associated with a loss of wildlife habitat. And this really is, this middle slide illustrates this question of the yield gap. So the yield gap is the difference between the potential yield of the variety that's being planted and the yield that the farmer actually achieves. And in this case, you can see it's an extremely poor crop. So the concept of land maxing is that through regenerative agriculture and agroforestry, as we've already described, we can diversify the landscape, greatly increase the production and productivity of the farming system, and maximize food security, and at the same time maximize the agroecological functions and maximize the social and economic benefits. So it's getting 5 wins, if you like, from the 5 capitals. And I think we need to think about those as profits. So in Africa, the conventional wisdom leads to land failing, and I think we have the opportunity then to close the yield gap through land maxing. That's it for the moment.
Okay. We are running a little short on time here, so I'm going to jump ahead on a couple more questions here. Ken and Matt, we'll maybe start with Ken. Closer to home here, Ken, if you can very briefly describe Foxhead Regenerative Ag Project that you're involved with. I know that you serve on the board with that newly found organization.
Okay, we just heard about grassroots efforts. Foxhead RAP was started with another African connection. Shelley and Jorg Rothman moved here from Namibia, and we're starting a project to involve local farmers in regenerative ag processes. Matt's a consultant. We have a large advisory board, and I'm on the board of that new group, and we're just getting started. We have some handouts there, but we're trying to make a difference at the local level. And here's why. Green Lake is Wisconsin, I mentioned before, the deepest inland lake. It's in trouble. In order to preserve Green Lake for the future, we need, just to get out of our oxygen depletion, a 46% decrease in phosphorus. To go back to how the lake was prior to industrial ag, we have to reduce 67% of the phosphorus. A tremendously daunting task. Matt?
Yeah, I think in addition to what Ken said, just providing resources and support for people who are farmers, landowners, community members that want to be part of the solution moving forward, finding alternatives to what we see in our watershed, which is by and large a lot of corn and soybeans. And that's been the traditional cropping system that's been kind of pushed by our federal government, by the university system, but it is by no means, as you've seen in some of the slides from different parts of the world, that's not just in Africa, that's not just in Cambodia. All of those things are possible here if we work towards perennializing agriculture, adding woody crops. There's an incredible potential for nut production in Wisconsin. There's an emerging hazelnut industry. These are all really exciting possibilities that the Foxhead RAP project is working to ignite in our local community and watershed.
Very good, thank you. Okay, we're going to close with this question, and I'll address this maybe first to Mark and then Roger. What is the connection between regenerative agriculture and past epidemics, such as Ebola, and now with the current COVID pandemic? How can agroforestry protect undisturbed ecosystems and prevent future pandemics? We'll start with Mark.
I think, if we can design on a larger scale the whole whole rural development or whole landscape on the landscape scale, we can create buffer zones. We can create different zones, mixed zones, and industrialized or sustainable intensified zones, and we can create certain areas where we limit the exposure of humans to these other pathogens that are in the closed forest system and that will be contained by the forest inside this closed system. So we can limit exposure, we can limit spillover from these pathogens, and obviously animal and livestock farming is a big part of this. We need to stop the usage of antibiotics. We need to get the farm animals out of the feedlots and out of the farm, really on the pasture, like what Ken and Matt are doing, and this way increase the health of the animals, increase the immune system of the whole ecosystem on a larger scale. And that's also how to balance and stabilize the system. There's many more points, obviously, but I think these are the main points that I would come up with.
Roger, any parting comments on the connection between regenerative ag and pandemics?
Thanks. Well, I think Mark's actually covered most of the points I would make. We can see here that in the list on the left-hand side that the risk of zoonotic diseases increases significantly when natural ecosystems are disturbed, that deforestation and land conversion alter predator-prey dynamics, and that the ability of the ecosystem to self-regulate is hindered by land degradation. Finally, as Mark said, the interface between people and animals carrying the viral load is increased by illegal wildlife trade and wet markets for bushmeat. So to counter all of that, in the EndPandemics Alliance, we're looking at how to reform agriculture such that we rebuild the agro-ecosystem. And in this diagram here, the background of which is the cycle of land degradation and social deprivation, you can see that the breakdown of ecological function increases the risk of zoonotic disease, and that this is exacerbated by hunger and by malnutrition. And so all the things we've been talking about are ways to reduce the risk of zoonotic disease.
Okay, thank you, Roger. At this time, we'll invite questions to the panelists. Is it being undersold, the efforts of regenerative agriculture?
Great question. I just did some research today in a study called Project Drawdown. They looked at that increased grazing could sequester 16 gigatons of carbon by 2050, and that 40% of our ice-free land on the planet is available for grazing. And if we expanded that grazing into more areas, we could reduce carbon release 30%. And we talked about forestry. Well, forests, help sequester carbon. However, when forests burn, they release carbon. Grasslands take the carbon, sequester it in the soil. So if there is a fire, there's going to be some release of carbon, but a majority of the carbon is already in the soil.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible opportunity. And Mark touched on that, and Roger talked about that. There's so many acres of land that can be restored, that can be farmed in regenerative ways, and that carbon can the flow can be reversed to put it back in the soil. There's so many different factors in addition to what Roger was talking about in more tropical areas. In the U.S., there's a lot of policies that need to change in order for this to scale up. But it also is driven by consumer demand and consumer awareness. And I think sometimes, I know myself, being in the organic produce industry, there's pushback on the price, and that in that way it can be kind of classist or unavailable to a larger portion of the population. And that is something that needs to be addressed. But we also have to take into account the full cost of cheap food. And through policy and through awareness, I think that we can change that when we pay a little bit more to the farmer to produce food in systems that actually draw down carbon. That is directly benefiting our entire society, the entire world, because in a cheap food system that's based on monocultures, those costs are being deferred, not really even to the next generation these days. It's just a little bit further on in our generation that are paying the actual costs of that.
The human population is presently a little over 7 billion people. By 2050, it's predicted somewhere around 10 billion people. Can regenerative agriculture meet those needs, those food security needs of 10 billion people and growing?
Yeah, if you're suggesting that I should answer this, that's fine. It seems to me that actually it could be extremely easy if regenerative agriculture was scaled up to a point where it could have a major impact, because if we can close the yield gap, so currently, for example, maize yield is about 1.5 tons per hectare as an average over Africa, with a potential yield of around 7 or 8. So by closing that yield gap, we could greatly increase the productivity of the farming systems for staple food crops, and that would release land for back to go into tree crops or into back to forest. And in that way, we can both sequester huge amounts of carbon and also meet the needs of a population for food that is well above the 10 or even 12 billion that some people are talking about. So yes, to my mind, it's perfectly possible to completely resolve the issues of the food security, the food crisis, and also to meet the needs of climate change and also the needs for wildlife conservation by having a regenerative agriculture system on a big enough scale.
Well, very good. On that note, this concludes the panel presentation. I want to thank crop physiologist and tree biologist Dr. Roger R.B. Leakey, filmmaker, AgroSmart Innovations CEO, Mr. Mark Eberle, and regenerative ag farmers, Mr. Matt Borson and Dr. Ken Bates. Thanks to all our viewers, and know that this event has been recorded and can be viewed again at a later date on Facebook. I've been your moderator, Tom Eddy, and know that the future of regenerative ag is the path forward for feeding people, mitigating climate change, preserving biodiversity, and preventing future pandemics. And in closing, it's worth repeating the words of Aldo Leopold, the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Good day, everybody.